You say had like it's over. You two aren't friends anymore. Raleigh pressed, his brow furrowing. Randy's voice grew more agitated. He hasn't called or come to see me since I got hurt. I treated that boy like he was my own son. Raleigh shook his head, wrestling with the tangled web of emotions and circumstances that Randy had thrown into his lap. It had been nearly 6 months since the incident, and now Randy found himself caught in a legal battle, trying to obtain compensation by suing Grant Keel. The police investigation had reached a dead end. They believed Grant was responsible for Randy's injuries, but lacked sufficient evidence. To complicate matters further, the Keel family seemed adept at dodging accountability. There was no solid proof linking Grant to the altercation, and the weapon used had never been recovered. Raleigh pored over the police evidence, attempting to piece together the puzzle of what truly happened. He had gathered all the reports and statements, meticulously sifting through the chaos. From what he'd learned, Catherine "Cat" Keel had been a devoted and loving wife for 2 decades. The Keel family had moved frequently due to military assignments, living in various places across the U.S. and Europe. Throughout all that time, there had never been any signs of trouble in their marriage. But everything changed when her husband was deployed to Korea. Because of the nature of his assignment, the family could only join him if he committed to a 2-year tour. Otherwise, it was a 1-year stay, which meant Danny would miss his senior year of football. After much discussion, the Keels decided to buy a home in Ferguson, Grant's hometown. Danny would attend Ferguson High School, while Kat sought a job as a science teacher, a role she had filled at multiple schools before. Not long after Kat's husband went to Korea, she began to develop a close friendship with the young football coach, Kane, who had been married twice before. Their bond grew over several months, and Danny was well aware of their connection. In fact, it was common knowledge at the school, and suspicions buzzed among the faculty and staff. When Grant finished his military service and moved back to Ferguson, he didn't inform Kat or Danny of his arrival. Instead, he stayed with his brother for a while. Both Grant and his sister-in-law kept their distance from Kat and Danny, adding to the air of mystery and tension. As Raleigh reviewed the details and analyzed the videos, a plan began to form in his mind. Leland, Betty Lou, Bobby Lee, Lynn, and Grant were meeting again, this time with Danny present. Almost everyone, except for Lynn, had been informed that they were being sued for conspiracy related to the incident involving Randall Kane Jr. This situation had left Randy unable to work, and he was struggling to support himself. The lawsuit sought an astonishing $10 million in damages. "How bad is this going to get?" Bobby Lee asked, concern evident in his tone. Grant shrugged. "In a civil suit, they don't have to prove as much as they do in criminal cases. In a criminal trial, they need to show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Here, they just have to suggest it could have happened. Listen, I won't let you handle this alone. This is my issue, mine and Danny's," Grant said firmly. "I'll talk to Kane and his lawyer and try to settle if they drop the case against you all." "That's not right," Betty Lou interjected, her voice resolute. "We're family. We need to stick together. Lynn will defend us and fight for us." "Do we all agree?" Leland and Bobby Lee nodded in agreement. Bobby Lee wasn't blood related to Leland, but they had been friends since elementary school. When Leland married his sister, Betty Lou, it was one of Bobby Lee's happiest moments. "Is it settled then?" Leland asked. "We tell this Raleigh Cruz to back off?" Everyone nodded, a shared sense of determination filling the room. During the opening statements, Raleigh Cruz laid out his plan for the jury. He intended to demonstrate that there was a conspiracy among Grant Keel's friends and family to harm Randy Kane and then cover it up. He explained that while the police had been unable to prove who attacked Randy, everyone involved had worked together and should be held accountable. Lynn's statement was concise. She pointed out that there was not enough evidence for the police to charge anyone, and that Randy's lawsuit seemed like an attempt to exploit a family he had wronged by engaging with the man's wife. Cruz's first witnesses were emergency workers and doctors who had treated Kane. They described his injuries, which were indisputable and not self-inflicted. Although they had briefly considered that angle, it became clear that convincing the jury of self-harm would be unrealistic. Instead, it seemed evident that someone with a personal vendetta against Kane had inflicted the injuries. Next, Cruz called in the police officers who had responded to Kat's emergency call. They confirmed that the scene matched Cruz's opening statements. Finally, he summoned Catherine Keel to the stand. Kat took a deep breath, her nerves evident as she prepared to recount her relationship with Randy Kane. "Yes, I was involved with Randy for several months," she admitted. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as she continued, detailing her friendship with Randy, her struggles during Grant's absence, and the emotional turmoil that had led to her connection with the former coach. As her testimony unfolded, Raleigh could feel the stakes rising. Every word had the power to shape the jury's perception, to twist the narrative into something they could believe or reject. In this tangled web of relationships, loyalty, betrayal, and a desperate quest for justice, the truth remained elusive. And with every passing moment, it became increasingly clear that the battle ahead would test not only their resolve but also their very identities as family and friends. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Raleigh Cruz and his team braced themselves for the storm that lay ahead, determined to uncover the truth buried beneath layers of deception and emotion. Little did they know, the ramifications of this case would ripple far beyond the courtroom, touching every life entwined in this intricate saga of love, loyalty, and loss. Kat Keel sat in the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest as the scrutiny of the courtroom focused on her. She had never imagined her life would take such a tumultuous turn. The deep feelings that had developed between her and Randy Kane were undeniable, yet she struggled to articulate their complexity. While she denied having the same emotional attachment as he did, she admitted that she had grown fond of him in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. Randy had made comments to her son, Denis, which Kat brushed off as harmless. She believed Denis hadn't been affected by them. However, she couldn't ignore the way Randy had moved freely around her house, even when he had been in less than appropriate attire. She was aware of a minor conflict that had occurred between Randy and Denis, during which Randy had to take a firm stance to calm Denis down. At the time, she thought her husband, Grant, was stationed in Korea and was oblivious to the emotional mess that was unfolding at home. But everything changed when she discovered that Grant had been nearby and was aware of the situation. The weight of her emotional turmoil became unbearable, leading her to realize that she needed help for her mental well-being. As Lynn, her attorney, began to question her, Kat knew she was about to face some tough scrutiny. "Mrs. Keel, why did you choose to become involved with Randy Kane?" Lynn asked, her voice steady. "Objection," shouted Cruz, Randy's attorney. "The term involved may imply bias against my client." "Your Honor, that may be true," the judge replied, glancing at Cruz. "But it reflects the circumstances, and I will allow it. Mrs. Keel, please respond to the question." Kat took a deep breath. "I don't have a clear answer. My husband is a wonderful man, smart, handsome, athletic. He loves me deeply. But I was struggling with my own feelings. I was nearing my 42nd birthday, my son was about to go off to college, and my husband was far away. I felt lonely." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Coach Kane is charming and attractive. All the female students and teachers admired him, and I felt good that this younger man started showing interest in me. He knew just how to make me feel valued. I completely fell for it." Tears began to well up in her eyes, and Lynn handed her a box of tissues. Kat wiped her face and took a moment to collect herself. "I've learned a lot these past few months. I now know how to protect myself from people like Randy Kane," she confessed. "Objection," Cruz shouted, rising to his feet again. "Mr. Kane is not the focus today, and calling him harmful names is unfair and upsetting. I ask that this be removed from the record and that the witness be instructed not to say things like that." The judge considered Cruz's point before addressing him. Whether this is true or not can be decided at another time. However, I agree that it's inappropriate. But, counselor, let's remember, Mrs. Keel is your witness. You brought her here, not the defense team. Cruz sat down, red-faced and frustrated. Mrs. Keel, Lynn continued, do you think any of the defendants might have harmed Coach Randy Kane? Kat looked toward the table where her husband, Grant, and the other 3 defendants sat, shaking her head firmly. No. I can't believe they would act out of character. Tears flowed down Kat's cheeks as she added, if they were so upset that they would harm Randy, then I know they would never return to me. She covered her face, crying softly, feeling the weight of her choices. The next witness was the lead detective investigating the situation with Randy Kane. Could you please share your name, employer, and position with the jury? Cruz asked after the detective took an oath. My name is Kenneth Mann, and I am a detective with the Ferguson City Police Department, he replied. Thank you, detective. How long have you worked for the Ferguson Police Department? 22 years. I spent 15 years as a patrol officer and the last 7 as a detective. Detective, can you explain to the jury what happened that morning? Cruz prompted. My partner, Detective Brenda Lucas, and I were working on a stolen car case when our dispatcher directed us to an address where an alleged assault took place. We arrived at 1212 Conway Lane and found a man who had been hurt badly. He was being helped by the homeowner, Catherine Keel. The emergency medical team had not arrived yet, but we were told they were on their way. Detective, in your opinion, what might have caused the injuries you saw on Mr. Kane? Cruz asked. A heavy object, like a baseball bat or something similar, Detective Mann responded. Cruz then asked Mann to explain his investigation, starting with his interview with Kat Keel. So, Mrs. Keel did not know that her husband was in Ferguson? No, she did not. She thought he was still in Korea. It wasn't until a few days later, after I tried to contact him in Korea, that I found out he was back home in Ferguson. Did you find it strange that he was in Ferguson but had not contacted his wife and son? Yes, you could say that, the detective replied calmly. It raised some concerns. You interviewed Mr. Keel at his brother's house, correct? Cruz continued. Yes, I did. Did Mr. Keel know about his wife's relationship with someone else? He said he was aware. How did Mr. Keel find out about it? Cruz asked. He mentioned that while watching a high school championship game, he saw his wife and Coach Kane share a moment together. He believed that his son also knew about the relationship. Detective Mann, did Mr. Keel clearly say that was when he learned about his wife's actions? Mann paused for a moment before answering, no, he didn't explicitly say that. He danced around the question, and I didn't catch it at the time. He looked a little embarrassed. Next, Cruz played recordings from Leland and Betty Lou Keel's home security system for the jury. Detective Mann, what do you think about those recordings? At first glance, they looked pretty normal. They showed daily life with minor changes. But another way to see it is that the Keels might be clever, trying to create confusion about what they were really doing. Did you ask them about this? Cruz inquired. I did. Several times. It's all there in the video, the detective said flatly, his eyes scanning the jury. Roland played the recording from the doorbell camera, showing the events leading up to the incident involving Bobby Lee Guerin. The room fell silent as the footage unfolded, each second thick with tension. What significance do you see in this video? Cruz inquired, leaning forward in his chair. It mirrors the Keel family video, Guerin replied. At first glance, it seems genuine. But upon closer inspection, there's an underlying layer of deception, particularly with Mr. Guerin strategically blocking the camera that could see the Keel residence. Did you find that concerning? A dry laugh escaped from the man seated beside Cruz. Everything they did, all 5 of them, including the son, seems shady to me. When I confronted Mr. Guerin about it, he parroted the same line, the video speaks for itself. The courtroom absorbed this revelation. Roland adjusted his glasses before playing the last video, one Danny had sent to his family, announcing the pep rally schedule. "What did you think about that video, detective?" Cruz asked, his tone shifting to a more serious note. "I felt for the kid," the detective said, a hint of empathy creeping into his voice. He was reaching out to his family, but they cut off communication with him. "It's tough knowing your mother is in a compromising situation with her coach and feeling like you can't share that with anyone." Cruz pressed on, "When did Danny Keel send that video to his family?" "1 week before the incident with Coach Kane," the detective replied. "Did you happen to notice what Danny was wearing in that video?" "A black hoodie and dark jeans," the detective remarked, his eyes darting toward the jury, who shared a knowing chuckle at the similarity to the Keel family's wardrobe. "During your investigation, did you confirm that Danny Keel attended the pep rally on the day of the incident?" Cruz asked, shifting the focus. "I did confirm that," the detective affirmed. "I spoke with the high school principal, who assured me that Danny was there the entire time, even helping him out since the principal had to fill in for Coach Kane." Roland chimed in, handing a copy of the Ferguson newspaper to the detective. "You can verify Danny's presence by checking the newspaper's website." The front page of the paper prominently featured a photo of the football team at the pep rally, with Danny standing next to the high school principal. "Detective, can you describe what Danny Keel is wearing in that photo?" Cruz prompted. As the detective studied the image, his eyes widened, and his mouth fell open in disbelief. "He's wearing a black hoodie and dark jeans, just like everyone else in his family." Cruz pressed further, "Did you confirm what Danny Keel was up to in the days leading up to the pep rally?" The detective shook his head. "We only knew he was at school. We had no reason to believe he left the campus." He paused, casting a sharp glance at the defendant's table. "That's on me. I should have suspected that his dad, being as crafty as he is, taught him a few tricks." Lynn, sitting nearby, disagreed vehemently. "Objection," she shouted, interrupting the proceedings. "The witness's remarks should be stricken from the record." The judge considered this for a moment before responding. "Counselor, I'm overruling your objection. Mr. Kane was indeed a coach in the past. I once coached my son's little league team, and whenever I meet any of his former players, they still call me Coach Bowman. For now, I'll allow the use of the title coach." As Cruz prepared to delve deeper, he was caught off guard by Lynn Dunaway's amused expression. "Now, Coach Kane," he began, returning his focus, "can you tell the court about your relationship with Catherine Keel?" Coach Kane adopted a solemn expression, his voice steady. "I cared for her deeply. I never intended to develop feelings for someone who was married, but sometimes emotions lead you to unexpected places." In a different part of the building, the mood shifted as Danny sat in the office of Keel and Dunaway later that evening, a mix of pizza boxes littering the table. "How did he figure this all out?" he asked, glancing around at the gathered group. "It seems like Roland Cruz is sharper than most give him credit for," Lynn replied thoughtfully. "He connected the dots. Your dad, Uncle Betty Lou, and Bobby Lee were all part of a cover-up, a way to make it look like you were targeting Kane. Maybe you all were too clever for your own good." Betty Lou interjected, "He either hasn't realized that I dropped a bike near the school, or he can't prove it, which is why he's not mentioning it." "What's our next move?" Betty Lou asked, her eyes scanning the room. "I want to offer a settlement to Kane," Grant said, his voice firm. "No." Everyone replied in unison, their voices echoing in the small office. "We have to stick together," Betty Lou insisted. Danny, Leland, and Bobby Lee nodded in agreement, solidarity evident in their expressions. "How much did today's proceedings hurt us?" Danny asked, concern etching his features. "It left some marks, no doubt," Lynn replied. "But Kat actually helped us more than she hindered us. Her comment about the predator was spot on." Lynn glanced at Grant, her brow raised. "What did you think of her testimony?" Grant shrugged, a pained expression crossing his face. "I'm glad she brought up the predator part, but overall, Her testimony didn't sway me. She'll always be part of my life as Danny's mother, but that's where it ends. He squeezed Lynn's hand gently, a gesture of reassurance. Tomorrow, Kane will testify, and I believe Cruz will wrap up the plaintiff's case shortly after, Grant continued, trying to keep the group's spirits up. We should get through our list of witnesses quickly, so we'll know the verdict by the day after tomorrow, good or bad. The group sat in contemplative silence, each of them processing the impending conclusion of the trial and the potential ramifications of the verdict. As expected, the first witness called the next morning was Randy Kane, the former head coach of the Ferguson Wildcats football team. Once he took his oath, Raleigh Cruz wasted no time. "Coach Kane," he began, prompting an immediate objection from Lynn. "I object," she interjected. "Mr. Kane is not currently working as a coach." I remind Mr. Cruz that Mr. Kane's position ended because of his relationship with a married teacher. The judge considered her objection for a moment before shaking his head. "Counselor, I'm overruling your objection. Mr. Kane was indeed a coach in the past. Now," Cruz continued, "can you elaborate on your relationship with Catherine Keel?" Coach Kane put on a somber expression. "I cared for her. I never intended to develop feelings for someone who was married, but sometimes emotions lead you to unexpected places." The trial unfolded, filled with twists and turns, as each character navigated their personal and collective challenges. The stakes were high, and the outcome remained uncertain, but the bonds of family and friendship shone brightly amid the chaos. "It was wrong, and I sincerely apologize to her husband for my part in what happened." Randy Kane paused, looking at Grant with a mixture of remorse and determination. "But I was mistaken. That doesn't make what they did to me right." Randy pointed with frustration at the defense table, where the Keel family sat. Cruz, his attorney, raised his hands in a soothing gesture, trying to calm the tension in the room. "Did Mrs. Keel feel the same way about you?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Yes," Randy replied, "or at least that's what he believed. She told me she cared for me. But whenever I suggested she leave her husband for me, she would shut me down. We would talk about her husband after our time together, but if I ever said anything negative about him, she'd get upset. She wouldn't let me speak ill of him, which I found odd." He shook his head, recalling the complexity of their relationship. "I mean, we shared those moments for hours, and I could see she found joy in them. But the second I compared those times to being with her husband, she'd confront me." His gaze drifted to Kat, who sat quietly in the back of the courtroom. A look of sadness crossed his face as he added, "The only mistake I made was falling in love with the wrong person and trying to do what I thought was right." He turned back to the jury, who seemed skeptical of his testimony. Cruz glanced at the jurors, sensing their lack of empathy for his client. "What about your relationship with her son, Danny?" he asked, redirecting the focus. "It was his first year at Ferguson High, and I was the new head coach," Randy said, his voice gaining strength. "Danny had a lot of potential. I believe I helped him develop into one of the best quarterbacks in the state, maybe even the country. We had a close relationship, and I thought he saw me almost as a stepfather. Now, I realize I might have been wrong. If Danny is the one who harmed me, I guess I never really knew him at all." Cruz wrapped up his questioning and handed the floor over to Lynn Dunway, who prepared for her turn with a measured confidence. "Mr. Kane, how do you define a man?" she asked quickly, catching him off guard. Randy frowned, trying to understand why that question mattered. Lynn assured him it would become clear. The judge allowed the question but warned Lynn to keep it brief. "A man is someone his teammates can always count on," Randy replied, his unease evident. "He puts in full effort and lives in a way that makes him proud of what he does for himself and his team." "Mr. Kane," Lynn continued, "you feel so strongly about this that you have a sign over the locker room exit, right?" She showed him a photo of a sign that read, "Play like men today." "Yes," he replied, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "When the players leave the locker room, they touch the sign." Do you think any part of that meaningful definition of being a man reflects your relationship with Danny Keel? Lynn pressed, her tone direct. Randy stared at her in silence, the weight of her question hanging in the air. Judge, can you please ask a witness to answer that? He interrupted, desperation creeping into his voice. No. Lynn cut in sharply. Is that what you wanted to hear? No, my actions didn't match what a man should do. I made the mistake of falling for someone I thought loved me back, a married woman. Lynn emphasized, yes, a married woman, making sure the point landed. Mr. Kane, please explain the incident when you had a disagreement with Danny Keel. Randy looked taken aback for a moment. What? I never fought Danny. Are you talking about that time I thought he was angry and might come at me? That was just a small argument, there was no real conflict. Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Kane, Lynn replied smoothly. You often talk about mentoring Danny and helping him become the quarterback he is today. Did you receive coaching offers from colleges after Ferguson won the state title? Yes, I got several offers, Randy said, his pride evident. But because of the incident, all of them were taken back. Really, Mr. Kane? The incident caused that? Lynn asked, walking over to where Randy was seated. She collected some papers and brought them to the witness stand. Are these your offer letters? She queried, her eyes locking onto his. After a moment of looking at the papers, Randy confirmed they were indeed his offers from different colleges. Mr. Kane, each of these letters seems to depend on your ability to convince Danny Keel to join you, is that correct? Lynn's voice was steady, but Randy felt a surge of heat rising to his face. How did she manage to get those letters? He wondered. Yes, that's right, he admitted sharply. Danny was determined to go to West Point, just like his father. He had a recommendation from his congressman and everything. You kept pressing Cat Keel to try to change his mind about attending a college where you would be employed, didn't you? Lynn accused. Yes, but I believed it was the better choice for him. If he played for a Division I school, he could get into the NFL and make a lot of money. He would be set for life. And if I followed him into the NFL as a coach, I'd be set for life too, right? Randy replied, frustration creeping into his voice. It seems your reputation as a coach depended heavily on your connection with Danny Keel, didn't it? Lynn shot back, challenging him. Randy shot her an angry look, feeling cornered. Lynn turned to the judge, her tone crisp. I have no more questions for this witness, Your Honor. After a brief recess, it was time for Lynn to call her next witness, Danny Keel. After being sworn in, Danny took his place on the witness stand. Danny, when did you first find out about your mother's relationship with Randy Kane? Lynn asked, her tone serious. I don't remember the exact date, but it was pretty soon after it started, within a day or two, Danny replied, his voice steady. And what did you do after finding out? Lynn pressed, eager for details. I called my dad on FaceTime to let him know what was happening. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom as Kat realized her son's loyalty lay with his father, not her. What did your dad say? Lynn continued, sensing the tension in the air. At first, he didn't believe me. Then he was shocked. After a while, he became very calm and said he needed time to think. A few days later, he told me to observe Mr. Kane and my mom's actions for the time being. So that's what I did. When your mom realized you knew, what happened? Lynn asked, leaning in. She told me to keep quiet, saying it would be better if I didn't say anything, Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom was silent, the gravity of the situation settling heavily on everyone present. As Lynn looked at the jury, she knew she had to navigate these treacherous waters carefully. The truth was coming to light, and it was only just the beginning. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Danny took the stand. Lynn, poised and confident, moved closer to the jurors, her gaze scanning their faces. She could see the sympathy in their eyes as they focused on Danny. Danny, Your mother mentioned a small argument that Mr. Kane referred to as a dust-up. Can you describe that incident for the jury? Danny cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the circumstances. I was sitting in the kitchen, and my mom and Mr. Kane either didn't notice or didn't care that I was home. Mr. Kane came out of my mom's room, and it was obvious they had been together. He started making rude remarks, and I stood up to address him, but he just pushed me aside. I hit the floor so hard that I could barely breathe when my head struck the stone floor. It felt like I was going to pass out. After that, he made a couple of disrespectful comments about my mom before he returned to the bedroom. Gasps filled the room as the audience absorbed the gravity of Danny's words. Kat's face turned pale as she began to realize just how much Mr. Kane had disrespected her family. Across the courtroom, Raleigh Cruz, the plaintiff's attorney, watched in shock. Any support for Randy Kane from the jury had vanished. Danny, Raleigh began, there's been a lot of talk about a video you made inviting your family to your pep rally. The plaintiffs claim that you, as a high school student, were the leader of a plan to hold Mr. Kane accountable for his actions and then conceal it. They believe you created this scheme during homeroom or possibly lunch. Lynn paused for a moment, letting the laughter die down, and noticed several jurors looking at Danny with newfound respect. Can you share more about this video? She asked, gesturing to the screen where the footage was being displayed. Danny looked sincerely at the jury. I know you've heard a lot during this trial, but the video really does explain everything, he said, his eyes pleading for understanding. Lynn nodded, satisfied, and handed the floor to Raleigh Cruz, who had just one question for Danny. Danny, do you know who confronted Randy Kane outside your house? Danny glanced at me, then back at Raleigh Cruz, a sense of resolve washing over him. Yes, I do. Raleigh paused, surprised by the confidence in Danny's voice. Who was it that confronted Randy Kane? I did, Danny replied firmly. I confronted him about what he did to me and for his actions concerning my mother. A collective gasp echoed from the audience, and Kat exclaimed, No, Danny. The judge banged the gavel to silence the crowd. Raleigh Cruz couldn't hide the victorious grin that spread across his face as he took a mocking bow towards Lynn. No more questions for this witness. As Danny stepped down from the stand, Lynn called up her next witness, Grant Keel, my brother. After confirming what Danny had said, Lynn asked Grant about the video that captured the incident involving Kane at our front door. The video speaks for itself, Grant replied, eliciting a light laugh from the jury. Do you know who confronted Randy Kane outside your home? Lynn inquired. Yes, I do, Grant said, meeting the jurors' eyes. It was me. I confronted him for hurting Danny and for being involved with my wife. Objection, shouted Raleigh Cruz from the plaintiff's side. Your Honor, Danny Keel has already accepted responsibility for the confrontation. The defendants are only trying to confuse the jury. Mr. Cruz, you opened the door for this line of questioning. Your objection is overruled, the judge said firmly. Raleigh Cruz took a breath, then asked Grant a straightforward question. Who's lying, you or your son? Grant shrugged, his demeanor calm. Neither one of us is lying. Saying we're both telling the truth is the same as saying both of us are, wouldn't you agree? Cruz blinked slowly, trying to wrap his mind around Grant's response, while several jurors chuckled at the exchange. Lynn wrapped up her questioning and called the next witness, Leland Keel. The line of questioning for Leland followed a similar path. After confirming the accuracy of the recording and stating that the recording speaks for itself, Lynn asked, Do you know who confronted Randy Kane outside your brother's house? Raleigh Cruz shook his head, clearly frustrated. He already suspected the answer to Lynn's question. Yes, I do, Leland said confidently. It was me. I confronted him for hurting Danny and for being involved with my brother's wife. Raleigh glanced at the jurors, many of whom were struggling to hide their smiles and laughter. He looked at his client and shook his head in disbelief. With Leland done, Lynn called Betty Lou Keel to the stand. She stated simply, "Yes, it was me. I confronted him because he attacked Denis and was involved with my brother-in-law's wife." Bobby Lee Guerin echoed her conclusion. "Yes, it was me. I hurt him for attacking Denis and being with my sister's brother-in-law's wife." Raleigh Cruz addressed the jury with visible frustration. "I don't need to prove anything. They have already shown it. One or more of the defendants harmed Randy Kane. Afterward, they worked together to hide what happened. You, the jury, know the truth. Please do your job and support Randy Kane." Lynn's closing statement was short and pointed. "The only thing the plaintiffs have shown is that Randy Kane is not a good person. He gets involved with married women and then harms their children. If there were real proof, they would have been arrested. Please rule in favor of the defendants. Thank you." With that, Judge Bowman struck the gavel, sending the jury out to deliberate. While they considered their verdict, the group known as the Ferguson Five gathered in my apartment, sitting around a table piled high with pizza. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. They felt they had done their best, each one having testified truthfully about the events, even if they hadn't shared every detail. They admitted to hurting Kane, which was true in a way, and guilt lingered over them for what had happened. "How long do you think the jury will take?" Bobby Lee asked, tearing a slice of pizza in half. "I don't think it will take long for them to decide if we're guilty or innocent," Leland replied, his brow furrowed with worry. "But I hope they see the truth in what we said." "Yeah, me too," Denis added, glancing at his father. "It's just. I want this to be over. I want to be able to move on without all of this hanging over us." As they sat together, sharing stories and laughter, the weight of the trial hung in the air, but so did a sense of camaraderie. No matter the outcome, they were united, ready to face whatever came next together. As the tension in the courtroom simmered, Grant Keel couldn't shake the feeling of regret. He knew the jury's deliberation on how much to award Randy Kane would consume a good chunk of their time, possibly today, maybe even tomorrow. With a contemplative bite of pizza, he stared thoughtfully at the floor, wishing he hadn't allowed the others to dissuade him from negotiating a settlement with Kane. If he had, they could have put this entire ordeal behind them. "How's your mom doing?" Betty Lou asked, her voice breaking through his reverie. Danny Keel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, a frown etched across his face. "She's not doing well. After school, she goes straight to her room and cries. We've talked about the divorce and how she's feeling, but she's still struggling to accept it. When I asked her how she thought things would end once Dad found out, she got really emotional. I had to give her space to calm down. She thought Dad would get mad but eventually fix everything like he always did when problems came up." Danny's voice was heavy with the weight of his words. "She's just now starting to realize that this time, there's no fixing it. She's responsible for what's happened. She made a big mistake, and she can't see how she got here." Leland, sitting nearby, nodded in agreement. "That's true. She made her choice, and now she has to face the consequences." "Thanks for the insight, Mr. Reddit," Betty Lou shot back sarcastically, rolling her eyes. "I almost feel sorry for her. I've been her friend since you two started dating. I lived just 20 minutes away, and if she was feeling lost or had feelings for someone else, she could have called me. I would have rushed to help her. Any of us would have. Instead, she pushed away the people who cared the most so she could be with that guy." As they reflected on the missteps of those they cared for, Lynn's cell phone beeped, cutting through the atmosphere. "Judge Bowman's clerk," she announced, her tone shifting to one of urgency. "The decision is in." The five of them, along with Lynn, stood as Judge Bowman entered the courtroom. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Once everyone settled, the judge confirmed with the jury foreman that they had reached a unanimous decision. The foreman handed the findings to the bailiff, who then presented them to Judge Bowman. Grant closed his eyes, his stomach tightening with dread. He knew what was coming. The case of Randy Kane against Grant Keel, Daniel Keel, Leland Keel, Betty Lou Keel, and Bobby Lee Guerin was about to take a turn he dreaded. As the judge began reading the verdict, disappointment washed over him. We find that there was a plan to confront Randy Kane due to his relationship with Catherine Keel and his actions toward Daniel Keel. Grant braced himself as Judge Bowman paused, the weight of the words hanging in the air. He expected this outcome, but hearing it out loud was another blow altogether. We also find that the plaintiff, Randy Kane, should receive from the defendants a total of $1,000 for damages and $100 for additional penalties. The judge peered over his glasses at the jury, who looked quite pleased with themselves. Then he turned his gaze to Randy, whose face flushed crimson with frustration. "You let them off the hook. This isn't fair," Kane exclaimed, his voice rising as he pointed an accusing finger at the jury and the judge. Raleigh Cruz, seated next to him, tried to calm him down, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Do I need to ask the jury anything else?" Judge Bowman inquired, trying to regain control of the courtroom. The foreman shook his head, a satisfied smile on his face. Judge Bowman sighed and turned back to the defendants. "You have 90 days to challenge the decision, but I suspect you'll just accept it." As he dismissed the jury and ended the trial, the atmosphere shifted. Grant and the others exchanged light-hearted moments, a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. Unnoticed, Catherine Keel stood up and took a moment to glance at her former family, pride welling in her chest, before leaving the courtroom alone, tears streaming down her cheeks. There would be no appeal, the group had accepted this outcome as a victory. Grant, resigned yet willing to move on, wrote a check for $1,010, an amount made out to the court to pass along to Raleigh Cruz, eliminating any need for further contact with the former coach. Cruz, though disappointed, accepted the cards he'd been dealt. It was just the way these cases worked. After handing over a check for $77, his share after deductions, he slipped out of the courtroom, eager to leave the tensions behind. In the months that followed, Grant and Lynn returned to their legal practices with renewed focus. The experience had drawn them closer together, and soon, Lynn found herself spending more nights at Grant's apartment than her own. Their conversation shifted from the courtroom to their future, particularly discussing Lynn's apartment and the prospect of children. "I want at least one, ideally two," Lynn stated earnestly, her eyes shining with hope. Grant, however, hesitated. At 46, he felt he was too old to be a dad. "Just think about it," Lynn encouraged, gently squeezing his hand. "You'd be a great father." After much contemplation, Grant reconsidered. Finally, at the age of 47, he embraced fatherhood again. The birth of his half-brother brought a sense of joy to Danny, who was thriving at West Point. He enjoyed his engineering classes but, like his father, harbored aspirations of becoming a JAG attorney one day. But Grant and Lynn weren't the only new parents in the Keel family. Leland and Betty Lou had also decided to adopt a child. Betty Lou, knowing she couldn't have children of her own, had been unsure about adopting. But when her co-worker's 16-year-old niece unexpectedly got pregnant, Betty Lou and Leland discussed it at length before deciding to step in. The young parents weren't involved in drugs or alcohol, they were simply two teenagers caught in a difficult situation. After 8 months of anticipation, Leland and Betty Lou happily welcomed their new daughter, Leanne Keel, into their home on a crisp autumn morning in Ferguson. One day, as the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold, Bobby Lee Guerin called Grant and suggested they meet for coffee at the cafe. "Let's catch up," Bobby Lee said, his voice warm and inviting. Grant smiled, grateful for the opportunity to reconnect with friends as life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. He looked forward to sharing stories and laughter, realizing that through the trials and tribulations, they had each other, and that made all the difference. Grant sat across from Bobby Lee, feeling a mix of confusion and concern as his friend seemed lost in thought. They had stepped outside for a moment of fresh air, but now it felt like they were treading into deep waters. "Do you know why I got divorced?" Bobby Lee suddenly asked, breaking the silence as they settled down on a nearby bench. Grant shrugged, unsure of how to respond. "I know there were issues, but I never wanted to pry. It wasn't my place to ask." Bobby Lee nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember you and your family coming to our wedding back in Fayetteville, North Carolina. She was lovely, and you could tell we were both in love." Grant's mind drifted back to that joyful day, remembering Bobby Lee's wife's radiant smile and how happy they had all been. "Then you moved to Germany, right? 2 years later, we heard about your divorce," Bobby continued, his voice heavy with regret. "We both made mistakes. I had a lapse in judgment at a bachelor party in Vegas. When I came clean, it just led to more complications. Our marriage was in serious trouble, and counseling didn't fix it." She had developed feelings for someone else and just wanted to move on. Grant could see the sadness in Bobby Lee's eyes. "That was 10 years ago. It still stings, you know? I've felt pretty down about relationships since then." Grant understood. Bobby Lee was one of the kindest, most decent men he knew. He was good-looking, worked a solid job as a firefighter, and even had some patents to his name that supplemented his income. Yet despite his qualities, Bobby Lee rarely dated. His family had encouraged him to try online dating or find someone new, but he had always hesitated. "Okay, so where's this conversation going?" Grant asked, a hint of caution in his voice. Bobby Lee took a deep breath, glancing down at the table. "I've been seeing Kat." Grant's heart skipped a beat. "Seriously? You're dating my ex-wife?" Shock coursed through him, mingling with uncertainty. Bobby Lee nodded, still looking down at his coffee. "Yeah, we've gone out for coffee a couple of times and had lunch once. Nothing significant has developed yet, and nothing will without your approval. We both agree on that. She's also seen a therapist to help her work through her past relationship. I did the same after my divorce." Grant's mind raced. "You both made mistakes in your marriages, so I guess you have that in common," he said sharply. Bobby Lee didn't seem bothered by the tone. "Cheating on my wife was the worst thing I've ever done. The pain of being cheated on was almost as bad, but I'd rather feel that than the guilt I had." "Grant, you know Kat pretty well. Do you think she'll make the same mistake again?" Grant paused, weighing his words carefully. "I don't know, man. I never thought she would stray at all, so maybe I don't know her as well as you think I do. I hope she's learned from her past. I hope she won't disappoint again and can be a good partner for the next person. But I didn't want to take that chance." Bobby Lee nodded. "I'm willing to take a chance with her, and she's willing to take a chance with me. But I need your blessing. If you don't approve, I'll end things now before we get too involved." Grant leaned back, letting out a deep breath. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. How did he truly feel about his ex-wife coming back into his life? He still cared for her deeply, they had shared over 20 years of love, and no amount of time could erase that connection. But could they really be friends after everything? Could he forgive her? Could he let her be happy with someone else, or did he want to cling to his anger? "Listen, Bobby Lee, I think I'm okay with this," Grant finally said, choosing his words carefully. "I might not have the same bond with Kat as I do with your sister, but I think I can get close. As long as you both treat each other well and make each other happy, I'll support it. I want my son's mom to have a good life and feel good about herself. You're a great friend, and that could be beneficial for both of you. So good luck. If you get married, send me an invite." As the conversation wrapped up, Grant felt a sense of relief mixed with apprehension. The emotional turmoil of the past was still fresh, but perhaps this was a step toward healing for everyone involved. Meanwhile, in another corner of the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The civil trial was moving along quickly, though the judge tried to keep things authentic. The truth was that Kat hadn't been entirely harmed in this story, but her husband and son were kind individuals who wouldn't cause harm. But Coach Kane? That was a different story. Raleigh Cruz, Esquire, announced the attorney, looking serious. You should probably take that into account, as he will certainly feature in another story. Hey, listeners of Temptress Cheating Tales. If you enjoyed this story and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next wonderful story.